Let's build a password generator using React and TypeScript. In this app, you can decide what kind of characters you want included. You can choose uppercase letters, special characters, and numbers. You can also change the password length. When you click on Generate, a new password is created for you. You can then copy it to your clipboard to use it somewhere else. This is a small fun project to learn some React and TypeScript. So let's jump right in. Let's start with writing our app in React. I created a new React project using Vite with the React TypeScript template and removed all of the standard code. Let's start in our app.tsx file. We will define our variables first. Make sure to import the useState hook at the top. Then we create a const called includeUppercase and setIncludeUppercase, which is of type boolean and initially set to true. We do the same for includeSpecialChars and includeNumbers, but we're setting both to false in the beginning. Then we create a const called passwordLength and setPasswordLength, which is of type number and is set to 15 initially. Lastly, we create the password and setPassword const variables. Password is of type string and set to an empty string in the beginning. Great, our variables are all set. Let's continue with writing our app layout. First, we create a div with class name password generator. Inside, we add a form tag with the onSubmit property set to generate password. Let's define the function generate password above and leave it empty for now. We will write it out later. Inside the form tag, add an h1 that says password generator. Below, add a div with class name options. This will hold the input fields to adjust our password settings. Let's write our first input field to let us include uppercase letters. Add a label tag and set the HTML4 property to include uppercase. Let's add an input tag. Set type to checkbox and both ID and name to include uppercase. When the ID property of the input tag has the same value as the HTML4 property of the label, a click on the label will trigger a click on the input tag. We set the check property to include uppercase, which in the beginning is set to true. So we set the onChange property to an error function. Anytime we click the input, we want to set include uppercase to the opposite value of include uppercase. Also, let's add the text include uppercase letters before the input. Great, let's copy this label. Change the text to include special characters and set the HTML4 property as well as the ID and name to include special chars. We set the check property to include special chars. Also, we update the error function in the onChange property to toggle the include special chars value with every click. Repeat the same step for include numbers to make sure the properties all have the correct values. Then it's time for our password length input. Let's add one more label tag. Add the text password length. For the input, we set type to range and ID and name to password length. Set a minimum value of 5 and a maximum of 25. Our value will be password length, which we have set to 15, remember? When the slider changes, we want to run the callback function set in the onChange property. Here we add an error function that takes the event data e as the parameter. Anytime the slider changes, we want to set the password length to whatever the current value of the range slider is. We get this value with e.target.value. As you can see, TypeScript complains because it expects a number for password length but gets a string instead. So we simply pass this string into an integer. Next to the input, we set a p tag with class name as password length output. Here we want to display the current value of password length. As we move the slider, you can now see that this value changes. Just below our options div, we add a new div with class name password output. We set the value to the current value of password. In the beginning, this will be empty. Below, we create a second div with class name options. Here we want to display our buttons. Add one button with class name btn, type submit and the text generate. Clicking this button will trigger the form submission. Remember, we set the onSubmit property in our form tag, which will trigger the generate password function. Copy the button and change the text to copy to clipboard. Change its type to button. Set the onClick property to copy password to clipboard. Again, we define this function at the top and leave it empty for now. Lastly, we want to display a success message to tell the user that he or she copied the password to the clipboard. We set class name to success message. Inside, we add a p tag and write password copy to clipboard. Now we want to update class name to either hide or show this div. So we set a ref property and set it to successBox. At the top, make sure to import the useRef hook. Then we create a new const variable with name successBox and set it to useRef with type HTML div element. Initially, this ref is set to null. Now we have a reference to the div element and we can change its properties such as style or class name in our functions later. Now our password generator is set up, but it looks terrible. Let's begin styling it inside our app.css file. Inside app.css, we start by importing a new font. For this, I've chosen the encode font from Google Fonts. Simply copy the import statement to your file. For the ID root, we set a max width of 1280 pixels and a margin of 0 auto to center it in the middle. Give it a padding of 2 rem and align the text in the center. For the body, we set a light gray background with hashtag E3E3E3 and we set the Google font we imported at the top, in this case encode sans. For the password generator class, we set a white background, a padding of 2 rem, a width of 90% and a max width of 600 pixels. Let's make the border a little rounded with border radius 25 pixels. Again, we center this box in the middle with margin 0 auto, and we set the box shadow property to get a nice subtle gray shadow. Let's continue with the heading inside the form. Here we set margin bottom to 2 rem to create some space below. For the options class, we set display to grid. Then we want a layout with 2 columns, so we set grid template columns to repeat to 1fr. Add a gap property with 10 pixels to create some space between the grid. For the label, we set display to flex and align the inputs horizontally in the middle with align item center. Set text align to left. Let's create some space with gap 5 pixels. Then, for the class password length output, let's also add some space towards the input slider with padding left 0.5 rem. Nice, it starts to look a little better. Let's move on to the rest. For the password output field, we set a padding of 2 rem, a margin of 1 rem, 0, 1.5 rem, and we align the text in the center. Also, let's give it slightly rounded corners with a border radius of 10 pixels. The gray background with hashtag F1, F1, F1. On to the buttons. We give the buttons a padding of 1 rem, remove the border with border none, and make the corner slightly rounded with border radius 10 pixels. Increase the font size to 16 pixels, set the color to white, and make a blue background with hashtag 4782D6. To make the following hover animation smoother, let's add a transition for background with duration 0.3 seconds and transition timing function set to ease. When we hover over the button, we want to set cursor to pointer and change the background to slightly darker blue with hashtag 3B71B3. Now we have a nice smooth hover animation. Almost finished with the CSS. Let's style our success message. We set a green background with hashtag D0FFB3 and a dark green text color with the hashtag 4A7044. Let's decrease the font size to 14 pixels. Give it a padding of 0.5 rem and a margin of 1 rem, 0, 1.5 rem. Align the text in the center and make the corner slightly rounded with border radius 10 pixels. To hide it initially, let's set display to none. To make it visible, we will later add a message show class. When this class is present, we set display to block. Lastly, let's adjust the grid layout for the options class for mobile. To do that, we set a media query to screen and max width 480 pixels. When we have screens with a width of 400 pixels or lower, we want to change the columns in the options class. So we set grid template columns to repeat 1fr. This way the layout switches from 2 columns to 1 column for small screens. Nice, our app looks modern and clean. Let's continue with the fun part. Let's make it interactive. Let's start with the generate password function. It takes in the parameter e, which corresponds to the event data. As the type, we set react.formEvent HTML form element. The function does not return anything, so we set the return type to void. First, let's call the e.prevent default method to prevent the browser from loading again when we click the button. Then we define a few variables that will hold different strings to build our password. We define a const variable called lowercase of type string, which we set to all letters from A to Z. Then we define a const variable called uppercase of type string, which equals the lowercase string set to uppercase. Numbers is also a string which holds the numbers 0 to 9 as a string. Special chars is also a string which holds several characters such as the exclamation or the question mark. Now we create a const of type string called chars. This will hold the possible characters depending on the selection of our input fields. It will always have the lowercase string. If include uppercase is true, we also add the uppercase string, otherwise just an empty string. We do the same check for include numbers and include special chars, and add the respective strings if true. Then create a let variable called password of type string and set it to an empty string initially. Inside a for loop, we now iterate over password length. For each iteration, we want to add 1 character from chars to the password string. We do that by selecting a random index by calling math.random times chars.length. Because our index starts at 0, we round the number down using math.floor. After the for loop has run, we set our password state variable to the password string of this function. Let's try it out. When we click the button, we can see the generated password in our password output field. Great, it works. Now the last part. Let's copy the password to the clipboard. For this, we have our function copy password to clipboard. It takes an event parameter e of type react.mouseEvent HTML button element. Adding react.mouseEvent HTML button element as the event type indicates that the event handler function is designed to handle mouse events occurring on HTML button elements. Call the e.prevent default method to prevent the default behavior. Then let's call the navigator.clipboard.writeText method and pass the password state variable as the argument. Once we click the button, we want to show the div with the class name success message that says password copy to clipboard. Here's where our reference variable successbox comes in. In our function, let's show the box by writing successbox.current.classlist.addMessageShow. The question mark enables optional chaining, so we only access the class list property when it is null nor undefined. This is a common TypeScript practice to prevent runtime errors. We then set a timeout and remove the message show class after 3 seconds. Great, it works. However, we don't want the success message to show when there's no password yet. To do that, we check if password.length equals 0. If that's the case, the function returns immediately, so the rest of the code won't run. And you can see that it works. We generate a password and can copy it to the clipboard. There you have it, your own password generator app using React and TypeScript. So, how did you like this tutorial? Are there any other projects you would like to see in the future? Let me know in the comments, I would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos.